In this presentation, we continue looking at the phrase model and harmonic expansions, taking particular focus on the predominant area. We'll see a lot of similarities with how the predominant area is expanded or prolonged, and a lot of similar ways to how the tonic area was prolonged. There'll be a few changes. We'll see one additional way of prolonging the area and one way that isn't as common with the predominant expansion. We'll be looking at chord changes, inversion changes, passing motion, and neighbor motion. We don't see pedal motion happening as much to prolong the predominant area. It's technically possible, just something that we don't see as often. So let's start with chord changes. One common way to expand the predominant area is simply to change from one predominant chord to another. So if we're in friendly C major, we could simply change from a 4 chord to a 2 chord. Here we are in C. So by simply changing from one predominant chord, 4, to 2, we'd simply be expanding and elaborating on that predominant area. A very simple way to do it, and we would just add a P with a line underneath to show that we are expanding that area. Remember that in this case, if we are changing chords, we always want to move from the subdominant to the supertonic, from 4 to 2. We tend to not see motion happening the other way around. It can happen, but I'd say probably 99% of the time where you see these two chords together, it's going to be 4 moving to 2. Every once in a while, the 6 can find its way into a predominant area. There's a little bit of ambiguity there because the 6 works well as a tonic class chord because the 5 wants to resolve to 6 sometimes for a deceptive or evaded cadence. However, sometimes we'll hear the 6 sort of grouped together into a predominant area as well, particularly if 6 immediately is followed by 5. So if we go from 6 to 5 to 1, that 6 is definitely acting in a predominant way. Or sometimes we'll see some examples where it's grouped together with other predominant chords and could feel like a predominant expansion itself. So we will also see inversion change as a potent way to expand the predominant area. For instance, we could go from 4 to 4-6. That's absolutely fine. We can also go the other way around, from 4-6 to 4. Either works well. 4 to 4-6. Or 4-6 to 4, pardon the wrong note. And of course this works just as well in minor. Root position 4 to 4-6, or the other way around. So major or minor, that works well. We could also move from 2 to 2-6. Of course we'd put our P underneath the 4 and the 4-6. We could move from 2-6 to 2, or from 2 to 2-6. That's absolutely fine and a good way to expand the predominant area. One note though, in the minor mode, most of the time if we encounter the 2 chord, we're going to encounter it, if it's a triad, we'll encounter it in first inversion. Most of the time we don't encounter it in root position. So usually if we have that 2 diminished chord, we'll hear it as 2 diminished 6. And so we won't see an inversion change there as much in the minor mode. So we'll probably just stick to 2 diminished 6 rather than moving to 2 diminished if we are in the minor mode. So another very straightforward way that we can expand the predominant. We can also expand it through passing motion, just like we did with the tonic harmony, where we had passing motion in the bass. Essentially stepwise motion that continues in the same direction in the bass voice. So in this case, all of these bass voices are moving down by step, or moving up by step, and all of these progressions that you'll see can be reversed, though some of them it will be more common to have them be in the way that I've written them, and we'll talk about that as we go through. So let's start with the more common ones, which will be on the left-hand side, and we'll go to some of the less common ones on the right-hand side. Probably the most common way that we'll see some passing motion is to move from 4-6 to 4. So first inversion 4 to root position 4, with some chord intervening in the middle that harmonizes that passing 5th scale degree. So a la, sol, fa, something that harmonizes that sol together. A lot of the time when we see this context, it will be a 1-6-4 with a passing function. That's a really clear way to prolong that predominant area. Less common would be to see 3-6, but it is possible. A little bit less common there. But it is technically possible to have that 3 chord being less common in general. But that would still be a prolongation of the predominant area. Moving from 4 to 2 is common with this, and usually interceded by a 1-6. It's fairly common, and a good way to prolong the predominant. A little bit less common would be to go from 2 to 1-6 to 2-6. It's because that 2 to 1 motion feels a little bit less tonally directed. Typically when we hear 2, we want to go on to a dominant class chord. The 4 to 1-6 that we saw earlier worked well because we're used to hearing 4 going to 1 as sort of plagal motion. So that works well. Here the 2 to 1-6, a little bit less common, but still possible. 2 to 1-6 and then 2-6. But that would also be a way to prolong the predominant. We can then see some ways of prolonging it with neighbor motion. In this case, we're going from 4 to 1-6 to 4. This is the most common way to see neighbor motion when we are prolonging the predominant area. At least in a diatonic context. So if we're not using any chromatic accidentals, going from 4 to 1-6 to 4, very common way using neighbor motion in the bass to prolong that predominant area. We don't see this happening as much with the 2 chord. If we did, we'd end up seeing, so if we have scale degree 2 and then we had neighbor motion in the bass, we'd be going down to a 1 chord and then back to 2. It begins sounding a little modal then. Other possibilities would be 2 to 6-6 to 2, again sounding sort of modal, either like Renaissance music or almost sort of like Debussy. So a little bit less common in the common practice era, though still beautiful in its own way, and could certainly be used outside of that context. When we get to some chromatic voice leading, we will see some other possibilities crop up. We could have a chromatic neighbor chord for that 2-6 chord, and some other possibilities for the expansion of the 4 chord. But for right now, with diatonic part writing, moving from 4 to 1-6 and then back to 4 would be a good way to prolong using neighbor motion. And we just write that P underneath, and we would have it continue to be to prolong that predominant area. All right. So let's take a look at an example at how some of this would be accomplished in a piece. So the ending of Caterina Assandra's O Salutaris Hostia. She was an active composer at the beginning of the sort of end of the Renaissance into the beginning of the Baroque, active in Italy, and she was a nun in a convent and wrote music for sacred use therein. So here we are in F major. I'll take you through a quick analysis of this. So we're in F, and we have our cadential motion, our 2, our 5, and then 1. That 1 continues through the rest of that measure. I have the non-chord tones marked with parentheses. The next measure begins on a 6 chord, and then we proceed to a 4, eventually moving to a 1-6, a 4, and then a 1. So that whole phrase sounds like this. We cadence. So if we start adding functions in, we would have a predominant function for the 2, a dominant function for the 5, and a tonic function for the 1. We're going to skip the 6 for a second and go on to that 4 to 1-6 to 4. So here's 4, then 1/6 to 4. You may have already recognized that this would be neighbor motion in the bass, B flat down to A and then back up to B flat. So that would be a prolongation of the predominant area, 4 down to 1/6 and back up to 4, and then eventually to the tonic. So that predominant area expanded upon using neighbor motion. And ultimately this creates a big plagal cadence. Elaborate with the 1/6 and then back to 4, and then to the 1. So all of that predominant area setting up a big plagal cadence, big plagal motion that takes us to the tonic. Now we come to our 6th chord, and the 6th chord here is a little bit ambiguous. There is a legitimate question as to whether this is a prolongation of the tonic area or the start of the predominant area. I think it makes sense to view it in either way. There is some ambiguity here. And whenever there's ambiguity in music, there is potent possibility for our own personal interpretation. So we have to make a call if we were conducting this or singing this or performing this. How do we hear that 6th chord work in this context? Is it part of the tonic area? Or is it part of the predominant area? Here's some arguments for the tonic area. First, if we look at the bass voice, we have a really strong structural F. So we have this leap up to the F. It's very clear that we are rooted in F major here. However, I think there's also some arguments for hearing this as a predominant area. We had this strong F, it carries through, we've got this common tone from before, but we've just had a bar of 1. And so now that we have a slight change in harmony, it feels larger than expected. Because we've had this stable bar of 1, now to suddenly change to, maybe not suddenly, but to change to a new harmony is striking. Also the fact that this is happening on a strong beat. If we're feeling this in cut time, our beat 2s would be weak, the second half of the bar would be weak, and the beginning of the bar would be strong. So changing to a new harmony on a strong beat does seem striking. And the motion also seems to link it. What's happening with the tenor and the soprano seems to link this with what's happening afterwards. So depending on how we're hearing it, depending on how we're interpreting it, we'll interpret it either as an expansion of what came before, of the tonic area, or is it a chord change? Is it a chord change where we're moving 6 to 4 and starting a predominant prolongation? Now, whichever way that we analyze it, we can use that to influence how we interpret it. So if we hear it as part of that tonic area, maybe we phrase that bar and a half together. And then maybe we might start a rallentando and a crescendo when we reach the 4 chord. However, if we hear that 6 as the beginning of the predominant area, maybe we start all that motion a little bit earlier. We start the rallentando and the slowing down a little bit earlier. We start a crescendo a little bit earlier, perhaps. Perhaps a little bit exaggerated in that performance of it, but there's room for interpretation. Now, if we were to say that this was a prolongation of the predominant, we'd simply just move that predominant over and have that 6 start that. If we wanted it to expand the tonic area, then we would expand the line next to the T until it's underneath the 6. So not everything is always cut and dried when we're doing these analyses, but what they help us to do is to illuminate where there are very clear statements, for instance, this cadence. very clear: predominant, dominant, tonic. It helps us show where there are points where there need to be clarity. But it also helps us show where there's points where there's ambiguity and points that are open for interpretation in the music. And then we can bring our own artistry and illuminate the piece in our own individual way through our analysis of it. So that's some tips about the predominant expansion. The next video we'll look at the dominant expansion.